here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's the turn of the singer-songwriter, author and journalist Alan Clayson, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love and poetry. He's had a long and amazing career in music and also writing with his own band, Clayson and the Argonauts, and also various other musical moments in various bands, including work with Dave Berry, and has written over 30 books. I'll put a link of his website in the notes below, but has written, books on so many different people. But anyway, look, this is the interview. You're going to find out about everything you need to. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject that was the early formative years. Alan, it's over to you.
I mean, the first record that I ever owned was a record called What Do You Want by Adam Faith, who later became a well-known actor. And What Do You Want was a hit in 1959, and my grandmother brought me that, partly because she thought I looked like Adam Faith.
Right.
Later on, I latched onto Frank Ifield, who died who died this year in May, and his big hit was I Remember You, and he was actually an enormous star just before the coming of Merseybeat.
Okay.
And when Merseybeat sort of latched on, that I suppose was my truest road to Damascus moment.
Yes.
And that's when I made up my mind that I was going to sort of form and even lead a beat group. And I actually formed my first group in 1965. We were called Ace and the Crescents, and we never got far further than beyond a couple of rehearsals, which we used to do in one of the guitarist's bedrooms, and we were sort of barred from using it because his mother heard one of the groups say the word bloody, which was at the time one of the foulest oaths that British censorship would tolerate.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that's amazing.
Yeah. And then that's really what set me on the road to iniquity.
Yes, and what were your parents? Did they have much influence, or
only in a negative fashion?
Right.
Well, when I was about 15, my mother told me that she would die of shame if ever I appeared on stage with a pop group.
Right.
Well, she's very much alive today, although she's deep into her 90s. So, I mean, that didn't really help. And, I obviously, her attitude changed when I formed Clayson and the Argonauts.
Yes.
In 1975, and we were actually quite a happening group at one time. And I remember one time when we were headlining at the Marquee in London, and I wanted, after the show, I wanted the floor to swallow me up because my mother had turned up, and she was in this horrible. She came into the dressing room, which was typical of the time. The dressing room with all the walls covered in graffiti. I'm sure you must have entered somewhere like that. And somewhere in the corner, one of the support groups was rolling a spliff. And all I was wearing was a pair of underpants and a leopard skin jacket, and she, and like I say, I wanted the floor to swallow me up when she entered,
Well, absolutely. And what about your father? Was he around on the scene at all?
Well, yes, he was around on the scene, and I think that he was a bit bemused by the whole thing. Although he actually got quite defensive once when I'd been on in concert on BBC Radio 1, and I later had a single out, and somebody was actually made some disparaging remarks about me, and my father was surprisingly defensive about it. I mean, I wasn't there at the time, but this was just reported to me, and it was all, well, at least he tried, that sort of thing.
Ghosts, yes. Well, nice to have your bit of defence. And did you have any older brothers and sisters who gave you any kind of direction?
Well, no, I was the eldest. And consequently, because I was brought up, my upbringing was very much centred on the church.
Right.
And I was expected to be a sort of Soames Forsyth type character, the very responsible eldest child. And, and I was expected to do something fairly respectable. I think my mother had kind of earmarked me for the priesthood, although obviously that never happened. And and obviously, she actually said at one point that I was everything she didn't want me to be.
Right. My God, she didn't mess about, did she? She gave it to you straight.
Yeah, I mean, she figures quite heavily in my most recent book, Get Your Hair Cut, and that's how it's spelled, which came out in September. And it was all about the sort of issue of male coiffure during the 1960s and beyond. And it was a really big issue. It's one of the loudest issues of that turbulent decade. I mean, and perhaps today's sort of ponytailed sort of pneumatic drill operator or computer program or project manager would find it incredible that there was such a fuss about men having long hair. I mean, your hair, for example, would not have been acceptable in the 1960s if you were applying for a job.
Yes, this is true.
And it's and what was shocking was the fact that the length of your hair was more important to potential employers than your capabilities at doing the job in question. And I can remember that I did get interviewed for some job or other once, and as I was leaving, I heard somebody on the interviewing panel sort of snipe, I didn't like that hair, and so it went on. But I mean, in 1965, when I was researching this, I discovered that there was an actual haircut suicide by a youth aged 15 in Sussex, and he was so appalled when he'd been forced to go to the barbers, and he was so appalled at the sight of himself with his newly shorn hair that he immediately threw himself in front of a train. I mean that was the most extreme sort of gesture, I suppose. But I mean, in other cases, people, ran away from home because of it, because of the relentless moaning.
Yes. And well, there is that famous David Bowie moment, isn't there, where he's been interviewed by some BBC reporter. Yes,
Cliff. It was on a BBC TV magazine programme called Tonight, and he was the sort of chairman of the society. I forget the exact title. It was against the oppression of long-haired men.
Yes,
that was his sort of televisual debut when he was in a group called the Manish Boys. Or yes, it was the Manish Boys. The one after that was called David Bowie and the Lower Third. Excuse me. And I mean that was a sort of. That's the sort of thing that turns up on these sort of before they were famous type programs, and I mean, there's another instance. I mean, Frank Zappa had a recording studio deep in sort of, provincial California, and because he had a haircut that was sort of about an inch longer than the standard crew cut, he was persecuted by the local authorities, who actually arrested him on a trumped up charge of attempting to commit pornography. And for that purpose, before the trial came, he was advised to have a haircut to make himself look more respectable. And as a result, it didn't work. I mean, he was still sent to jail for something like a fortnight.
Right.
As a sort of gesture, and was put on probation, and he had his hair planed halfway up the side of his skull, and when he came out in 1965, he had like the shortest male hair in California, and he certainly made up for it later on.
Yes, it's a kind of yes, people just can't appreciate it. And also, no, with that, before they were famous moments, there's a nice one with, I think, a young Jimmy Page being interviewed, who's talking about his, I don't know, it was about a career that he was thinking he'd be going into.
Yeah, he was in a skiffle group, and he wanted to do something scientific. I forget what the precise thing. It was some sort of technician or something, and he was definitely going to do that because he kind of regarded the skiffle group as just, some sort of childish pastime before he entered the world of real work.
Yes,
he certainly sort of changed his mind for the sort of benefit of the record buying public.
So as we were just trucking through that sort of 60s period, the early to mid 60s, when you got up to 16, I think you were about 64, what was it, 67 by then, were you sort of following everything that was happening kind of culturally in the charts at that stage, like the Beatles, Stones, Kinks?
Yeah, very much so, although my reasons for doing so weren't necessarily musical. I mean, as I said, I formed a pop group in 1965, and my main motivation for doing that was I imagined it would give me more license to talk to girls from my perspective of being at an all-boys grammar school near Aldershot, which was the home of the British Army. But I mean, I think that the first group that I ever followed was the Dave Clark Five. Do you remember them?
Oh yes, I think, was it Dave Clark who was the very cunning, not cunning, but he was very good on business. Did he?
Yes, he was. Yes, he bought up all the Ready Steady Go archives. That was on ITV. It was a pop program.
Yes.
But yes, he was a very astute businessman. But I mean, I followed the Dave Clark Five because a Boy Scout patrol leader I admired said he liked them. And so I sort of followed the Dave Clark Five as others would a football team, perhaps.
Absolutely. And what was your first concert that you went to?
Well, that was the antithesis of the Dave Clark Five. The first major pop concert I ever attended was at the Albert Hall by the Mothers of Invention.
Right.
Frank Zappa's group.
That was a very cool moment, really, wasn't it?
It was their sort of British, their European debut performance, and it had a very profound effect upon me, not simply because of the music, but the actual presentation, which was completely different from what I'd ever seen of groups on television. It was, and like I say, it had a very, very enduring effect upon me. And after that, I never missed a Mother's concert whenever they came to London, although I sort of went off them in the early 70s, and I sort of moved on to other things.
Yes. And I was going to say, being at grammar school, you obviously were somebody who had that right, A-levels, university. You were a hot ticket at that stage. So what happened during that sort of teen period up to 16?
The thing is that when I was at grammar school, I'd been surprised at passing the 11 plus to go there. and as a result, I was in the C stream at the grammar school throughout my whole ignominious career there. And I mean, it was a kind of race between either me leaving or me being expelled by the end. And after that, I went to Farnborough Technical College to do business studies, where I might as well have done skydiving, for all the benefit that was. And then after that, I went to teacher training college to please my mum and dad. But I mean, there was never I had no intention whatsoever of becoming a career teacher. In fact, my actual alma mater was the formation of Clayson and the Argonauts shortly after I left college.
Yes. And you were 16 in 67, which was the summer of love. Were you sort of starting to sort of both drink and experiment with recreational drugs at this stage?
Well, the trouble is that where I lived, which is Fleet, near Aldershot. Do you know that?
No.
Well, the distance from Fleet to swinging London could be measured in years as much as miles. And the sort of excesses that went on, in the capital really boiled down to the sort of things that you discussed over a communal cigarette behind the bike sheds at school. And I mean, I didn't really have much to do with that, although I used to absorb what was going on through sort of when magazines like the International Times,
oh yes,
Oz, which you could get in a backstreet newsagent near Aldershot bus station, and that was the sort of thing that I kind of absorbed. And I mean, obviously, I sort of bought records as well, which I read about in Melody Maker and the New Musical Express and things like that. And I mean, it took a lot of sort of guile for my dad to allow me to go and see the Mothers of Invention at that time.
Yes.
And it was, I mean, that was quite a memorable day, not merely for the concert, because when I got there, I met up with a friend of mine and we sort of went in this cafe where there were a couple of long-haired blokes tunnelling into curry and chips. And they looked as though they wanted to speak, and they did, to us, and they sort of gleaned that we were just sort of very naive sort of yokels up from the country, very self-conscious about our short hair. And they started laying into us. They sort of saying, well, the purpose of the Mothers of Invention is to have a go at sort of, plastic people. They called us plastic people like you. And I mean, I suspect that the yous that were calling, being like that, probably ended up as sort of, primary school teachers with leather elbows, very respectable heads of family. Whereas obviously I went in the opposite direction. I sort of went in the way that perhaps they'd imagined they would go.
Right. Yes. How weird. And then, because you were that perfect age as we trucked on through the 60s in a haze of excitement, when it got to that period where the 70s appeared, 70, 71, and, people like Hendrix and Joplin and Morrison had died. Brian Jones had also died the year before. We'd had Altamont, Charles Manson. There'd been lots of assassinations of the liberal left and various other people. How did you navigate that kind of... And then also the new musical kind of chapter appeared. You'd had you'd had the Beatles up to a good run. Well, most bands don't last that long. So was it a bit strange when suddenly you looked at people like Sweet and Slade and David Bowie?
Well, I mean, before that, I mean, all the old heroes had gone down. The Beatles, the Stones, well, not the Stones, but the Beatles had, thundered, and, the Dave Clark Five, the Yardbirds had mutated into Led Zeppelin. But what I found most depressing was that sort of school of post-Woodstock singer-songwriters. I'm thinking about things like Melanie and Crosby, Stills and Nash, very yawnsome people. And I very much welcomed the sort of the coming of glam rock, back to sort of cheap thrills of what had sort of motivated the beat boom a
Yes.
decade earlier. I think I bought some. I very much like Roxy music, for example, and I did buy a couple of albums by David Bowie as well. But I kind of, appreciated people like the Sweet and, dare I say it, Gary Glitter.
Oh, yes, we wanted to be in Gary's gang, didn't we?
Yeah, and Alvin Stardust. I mean, although I didn't actually buy any of their records, but I quite like the sort of visuals of it. And it was the same with punk, in that I didn't really, go for the music, but I did like the attitude as well. And the fact is that punk sort of thrust aside all those sort of groups like ELO and Yes and Genesis, who were sort of appreciated for, because they were sort of very, very serious and very, and all incorporated, sort of, they'd obviously listened very hard to sort of jazz and classical music and that sort of thing. But I think that punk was important because, like skiffle, many years before it, anyone could do it. I mean, the only concessions you had to make was having sort of, ripped clothes, short hair, thin ties, and making a horrible racket. But I mean,
yes,
it was a great time to be alive, I thought.
So had you been kind of before that, or during the 60s and 70s, early 70s, was it poetry? Had you sort of wanted to be a poet, or
yeah, I did want to be that, and I mean, I began to sort of write lyrics. Before that, I used to find lyrics quite hard work, particularly when you were trying to write songs in keeping with the times. I think the sort of road to Damascus moment was somebody like Bob Dylan, with that sort of I'm not talking about his protest songs, but when he sort of started doing those sort of stream of consciousness sort of stuff. I'm talking about, from Highway 61 and Blonde on Blonde, those sort of records. And it sort of led me to believe that you could actually write stuff that wasn't to do with sort of boy meets girl. Although my first efforts were sort of exercises in negative symbolism, in that you sort of write, it was almost like being like somebody like William McGonagall, he's supposed to be the world's worst poet. Have you ever heard of him?
No, I haven't. But
well, yeah. But I mean, you used to sort of start writing lyrics when you were supposed to be paying attention to, during double maths or physics or something at school. And you sort of write things that didn't actually mean much, but it sort of looked good. And who cared if it knocked the scansion out, as long as it rhymed? And a lot of groups were actually latching on to that as well. And they were sort of taking on, if you like, psychedelia without really getting the point. I mean, the Trogs, for example, did a single called Purple Shades, which went on about the bamboo butterflies of your mind, that sort of thing. But I mean, after that, after it was a necessary phase to go through before you actually started writing stuff that actually was meaningful, even if it was meaningful in a surreal sort of way. And I think that I actually started to sort of flourish as a songwriter, if you like, in about the sort of early to mid 70s.
Yes.
And I mean, there are a lot of really good lyricists around that time, like Brian Ferry, for example, David Bowie, as you discovered. Um, and it was possible to actually strike some sort of balance between writing standard pop lyrics and actually going off on some sort of surreal or abstract tangent.
What about people like Lou Reed? Did you sort of enjoy
Yeah,
those sort of
yes, I did.
writers?
Yes,
Yeah.
I did. I mean, and I remember that I actually got the first Velvet Underground album more or less when it came out, and that sort of opened a vista to me that you didn't have to write sort of soppy love songs, and you could actually write things about really sordid matters.
Mm.
As
And what
in,
about Captain Beefheart? Did he sort of come into your consciousness?
yes, he did come into it, because I mean I think it's partly because of Frank Zappa, and there was Frank Zappa produced his album Trout Mask Replica, and yes, I very much like that. Although these days, in retrospect, I don't think that an album like Trout Mask Replica is worn particularly well. I don't listen to it much. I mean, I don't know if you ever heard that.
Yes, I would every few years attempt to like it or listen and
Yeah,
understand it. But apart from a few bits and pieces and then reciting that thing about fast and bulbous,
and
which
the
some
blimp, the blimp on side 4, which was quite good.
yeah, I must admit, I preferred those kind of songs, rather kind of easier to listen to songs.
Yeah,
So, I mean, I saw the Magic Band a few years ago when they were doing a tour. I think it was about 10 years ago or 7.
yeah.
And they were brilliant. And John Drumbo French took the vocals and it was a great evening. But
Yes, that's right. And he sings just like Beefheart, doesn't he?
yeah,
But I
well,
mean,
absolutely.
but what I liked about that, I think, was the instrumentals, and I just don't know how they managed to, bring that off, because they were so complex, and so sort of dovetailed. And when you first listen to you think they're sort of making it up on the spot, but night after night they would play things like hair pie or something like that, precisely in the same way. And it was, when they were recording sort of Trout Mask Replica, they would rehearse sometimes, for 24 hours at a time, in this sort of remote sort of
Yes.
cabin where it was sort of created.
I think it left them slightly, quite emotionally damaged, didn't it,
Oh
really?
yeah, and I mean, because Beefheart was apparently some sort of tyrant, and he would
Yes.
actually, practice all these mind games on them all the time as well. And it's actually, I suppose it was almost like being almost rehearsed to death, when they
Yes.
did.
I think it probably because actually the drummer John French was very young at the time. I think it was he probably wouldn't. It was almost abusive, really, that relationship. He wrote a book about it,
Yeah,
apparently,
did
and
you interview him?
I have, yes, a few
What was he
times, and
like?
he was lovely. He was really nice. I said at the end, "What would you say to your 16-year-old self?" And bizarrely, he said to have joined Crosby, Stills, and Nash and made lots of money. So there you
Yeah,
go. I
well,
think
that makes
because
sense.
that experience, wasn't nice, and he didn't make any money. So there
Yeah,
wasn't there wasn't there wasn't many positives apart from obviously he could
well,
trade
I
all
think
the.
materially that was very sound advice.
So how did you, as you were navigating that 70s, you did teacher training and career, and I guess your career so when you did your glam, you didn't do prog, you didn't do folk, and you didn't probably do the Eagles. So when punk came along, were you, because you were a little bit old for punk, but
I
did
was
that?
a bit, yeah, I was a bit old for punk, and as a result, I didn't quite belong. And in fact, Clayson and the Argonauts were actually very much out on some sort of limb, which made it very problematic when we were seeking a recording contract.
Yes, I could imagine.
Although we didn't have, during that time, we were working all day, every night sometimes. It was like, for about 3 years, it was almost every night a gig. And it was all over the place. We were in Holland, we were in, Ireland, all over Northern Europe. I mean, if somebody at that point had told me, well, tomorrow night you're playing in a ballroom on Pluto, I wouldn't have been particularly surprised. It was, and I think that I've actually been to every city and major town in Britain and Europe, and I couldn't find about half of them on a map, because we'd always arrive and leave at night.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So when did the band form? When was the formation?
It formed in 1975, and then there was sort of, 2 years of sort of messing about. And then we actually had a really lot of coverage in the press all of a sudden, particularly in Melody Maker. As a result, we acquired a management. We required an agency. I mean, we had the sort of agent who imagined that a few hundred miles was a few inches on a map.
Yes.
And I mean, I do remember one night of sort of playing in the Hope and Anchor in Islington, and the next night we were on in Galway in the west of Ireland, which is about as far as you can go without actually leaving these islands.
My God, you did love to travel. And was it
travel?
And was it a very steady lineup? Did you sort of?
Yeah, we had a very steady lineup for about 3 years, and then then we got signed to Virgin Records, and we put this single out, which I think of it now, it's the single that dare not speak its name. It was a cover of a song by somebody called Wildman Fisher. You heard of him?
No, Wildman Fisher. My God, this is an education.
Well, he was a busker in Los Angeles, a street sort of musician, and he was actually a registered paranoid schizophrenic.
Right.
We did a song by him called "The Taster," and it was, as far as it cost something like £6,000 to record, and we did it in Psalm in London, which was where Queen did Bohemian Rhapsody. And once we'd finished it, we sort of, and it was released, we would only do it on stage, almost as if if it was at gunpoint or something like that. And it was around that time that the group began to fragment because of all the sort of soap operatics that make pop groups what they are.
Well, yes, absolutely. Because I think Bohemian Rhapsody, that was in Rockfield. So what studio did you use?
Psalm, that's SARM. No, it wasn't in Rockfield. It was done mostly in Psalm.
Right.
But I mean, you can check that out. But I was told that they did it there. And I mean, and then we didn't just record that particular song there. We also did it in Regent Sound Studios as well. But my heart wasn't in it. And after that, the group, I sort of formed another group, and we sort of another Argonauts, and we sort of continued until 1985. And at that point, that was when I joined Dave Berry's backing group as a keyboard player.
Yes.
Before that, in the Argonauts, I was the sort of chief show-off, if you like. And then I was with Dave Berry for about 5 years. And then after that, I was the keyboard player with Screaming Lord Sutch.
Nice. So
Remember
with your lineups, because you just go back to the
Argonauts?
Argonauts. I mean, this was kind of a weird period. Did you ever have much success? I mean, you did the Taster in '78, and then the album "What a Difference a Decade"
Oh
made
gosh, you've done your homework. That's brilliant. Yeah, that's right.
in '84. So you would have gone through a very interesting musical moment, really. There was obviously there's punk, there was post-punk, there was also that new kind of Trevor Horn production sound coming out. There was the Blitz Kids, the New Romantics. There was a lot of music going on. And where were you fitting in with the other artists?
Well, we were kind of. I mean, I suppose we were kind of new romantic. No, not new romantics. But I mean, I'm only saying that because I was actually took part in a documentary somebody was making about the new romantics. But I mean, the point is, our show was very much a show as opposed to coming up and doing just a few numbers with very minimum interaction with the audience. I mean, at one point, the Clayson and the Argonauts presentation was almost like one continuous piece of music. Like I say, we didn't really belong. And I think that was a lot of the problem. I mean, as I say, I mean, it was like if you go to see some promoter or social secretary, and he asks you, and you tell him that you're a three-piece heavy metal group, he or she knows exactly what they're dealing with. But I mean, the problem that I had was that Clayson and the Argonauts defied succinct description, and so did my solo performances, which I went into after that.
Yes, because there were some quite quirky bands. I remember people there was the Fabulous Poodles who brought out some odd stuff, and there was another one called Deaf School from Liverpool. And so there were bands who I can imagine had a really fantastic cult status, but never.
They did. And I know both those groups actually, because I mean we often used to appear on the same bill as the Fabulous Poodles, and I was kind of connected to Deaf School when I was in the Portsmouth Symphonia.
Right.
You know them?
No.
The orchestra that have unorthodox command of their instruments. And they sort of do bits from the popular classics.
Yes. So Virgin, after your single and £6,000, said that's not really going to be our bag, baby. But thank God for Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells. And
that's right.
Never mind the bollocks. So you got dropped. But then were you this Butt, the Butt label?
Well, that came about because somebody recommended we ought to get in touch with them, which we did, and they put out What a Difference a Decade Made.
Yes.
And I mean, it actually had very good distribution because one of those historic moments in my life was when I arrived in Dover in readiness for a tour of the Netherlands with Dave Berry. And I sort of hang about before the ferry boat, and I actually saw What a Difference a Decade Made in the window of a record shop, in Dover. And, that was quite a very sort of important moment for me, the tentacles had actually spread that far. And after that, I mean, it was a long time before we had another record out.
Yeah. And did you enjoy that process? Who was your manager, or had you gone through a few managers?
Well, at that time we didn't really have a manager. I mean, we had a management up until 1985, and then it sort of fell apart. I think it's fundamentally because they lost heart, although they worked very hard on our behalf.
Yes.
And and since then it's been more or less me sort of taking, the whip hand of the management.
So with your lineups of those bands, did they mostly end quite badly, and you went, no, this is my project, I'm going this way?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, also not only did the management lose heart, but I mean, my backing musicians did as well, and they sort of went on to other things. I mean, we had somebody, he died actually a couple of years ago, and he actually worked with Cliff Richard and then Dexys Midnight Runners and ended up in Geno Washington's Ram Jam Band.
Oh, I saw Gino. Excellent. Yes. So what was you mentioned just at the beginning about Adam and the Ants. Did
Yeah.
you say had you come across Adam during that period, or was that a bit
Yes, I
late?
had. Yes, I had. I think we were on the same program that was broadcast by Radio Telefis Erin, and that was shortly before his career took off.
Right.
But that's
So
the
that,
only time I've ever encountered him, face to face when we were in the studio waiting to be interviewed by John Peel. Um, so,
tricky times. Were you still in love with music at this stage?
Oh yeah, I mean, well, the trouble is, it's not a case of being in love with music at all. It's a case of being addicted to it, to not just recording and writing music, but performing it. It's a case of being addicted as surely as you could be addicted to heroin. You can't really give it up. Particularly if you've experienced a lot of attention from other people because of your music.
Yes.
And it's I mean, I never felt that I was a has-been. I always felt, as far as being a musician is concerned, as being a sort of almost but not quite made it. I mean, something that sustained me during what I think of as the wilderness years was I actually had a second career as an author, and I mean, that began in 1985 with my first book, Call Up the Groups, The Golden Age of British Beat.
Right.
And I've actually had about 30 books published since then.
You have been very prolific on your publishing.
Well, it includes a couple of bestsellers, actually, because I did the tie-in book to the film Backbeat. Do you remember that film?
Yes, I do remember it well.
Yeah, about the Beatles in Hamburg. And we also had a bestseller, After a Fashion, with a book called Beat Merchants, and an authorised biography of the Yardbirds. And I also did a book called Death Discs, which was about things like the Leader of the Pack and Terry by Twinkle and Don't Go Down in the Mine, Dad, and and that sort of Johnny Remember Me.
Yes.
That actually elicited, I did an hour-long programme on Radio 2, discussing Death Discs, which I kind of scripted as well. But unfortunately, that didn't actually begin a career as a sort of national disc jockey. That was just a one-off.
Oh, that's such a shame. So then when you decided that was it with the Argonauts, and that was around 86, you decided to become a solo performer. So then at that time you decided to start writing as well. Had you written for things like Oz before that? And
yes, I had. I had written for Oz. I was prominent in the notorious School Kids Oz.
Oh, the Rupert Bear.
Yeah, which was the subject of the sort of an obscenity trial in the Old Bailey.
Yes. And what bit had you written on that one?
I'd written 3 articles. I mean, they were fairly anodyne compared to the other articles that were in it. And that was an exercise in covering up because I didn't want my mum and dad to find out I'd been involved.
No, I would have been horrifying, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah, although I did sort of give it some showbiz at college when it came out, But yeah, that was my first encounter with writing on a national level. And the next time was when I was in a music equipment shop in Camberwell. buying some strings, and I noticed that behind the counter was a former member of the Dave Clark Five, them again.
Yes.
And I recognised him, nobody else did. And I sort of, I was a bit overwhelmed, and I spoke to him for the rest of the afternoon, and we decided to write an article, or he decided to let me interview him for an article for Record Collector about the Dave Clark Five. And when that was published, other articles followed, and eventually I was approached to do my first book, Call Up the Groups, The Golden Age of British Beat.
Yes, this was 85. So
yes.
suddenly, from that kind of career, spluttering around, but sort of doing various bits and pieces in the band, you write that book. Then 2 years, 3 years later, you do Back in the High Life about Steve Winwood.
Yeah.
Then you do Only the Lonely, the Big O. Then you do George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Death Disc, Swinging Sheffield, Backbeat, which is that fantastic. You are on what was in the water? You were
well. It was a domino effect. The point is, I had to make a living.
Yes.
And I often I was approached to do books about subjects about which I knew at the time I knew very little.
Oh, I thought you were going to say the opposite. I thought you were going to
Well, obviously I knew a lot about things like the Yardbirds and who else did I do? The Trogs. I did one on them, and I also did a book about a composer called Edgar Varese.
Yes, I saw that one. And tell us more about. I shouldn't.
Well, the thing is, I kind of was turned on to Edgar Varese by his very liberal-minded music teacher at grammar school. And just the same as some people sort of latch on to Indian music straight away.
Yes.
Well, I liked Varese straight away. And I later discovered that he was much admired by Frank Zappa as well. And so, a book about Edgar Varese, I actually solicited it. I actually approached a publisher about doing it, and it was accepted. Although, interestingly, the book that followed that was an authorised biography of the Trogs, which was a sort of exact opposite extreme to Varese. Although, one of the attractions of Varese was he did the only well-known, if that's the word, classical piece of music that consists entirely of percussion. It's called ionization. Have you ever heard that one?
No, my God! But one should embrace this whole new world. Really.
But
yes.
I'm obviously going off on tangents here, but one of the results of me writing the Edgar Varese biography, which incidentally was about the poorest selling book I've ever done, was that in 2009, I got a phone call from California by somebody claiming to be Gail Zappa. That's his widow. And she'd got my Edgar Varese book because he was Frank's favourite composer. And she said, we must meet up next time I'm in London. And a few weeks later, she was in London, and we went for a meal at this restaurant in Covent Garden. It was a Nouvelle Cuisine place. Have you ever had a Nouvelle Cuisine?
I have. We have had that once or twice. I must admit.
You come out feeling famished.
Yes, I can imagine it's.
But the upshot of it was that Gail offered me the job of writing Frank's authorised life story, and I was overwhelmed. I thought, God, this is a pension plan.
Yes.
I did express doubts. I said, look, I'm an English writer. I don't understand things like, for example, the US education system, but she felt that it would make me more objective about it. And after that, it took years before we obtained a publishing deal, not because, they didn't, people weren't keen on it. Anything, publishers were too keen on it. And there was a lot of messing about. And eventually we got a publishing deal. And the book's apparently coming out now in next spring, although I'll only believe it when it happens.
Yes, this has been a long time coming then.
It was a long time coming, and it was actually completed ages ago. But in the interim, Gail used to give me sort of jobs to do. For example, I had to write the programme notes when they premiered Frank Zappa's 200 Motels at the Royal Festival. And I had to act as a sort of compere, or one of the compares, at the Roundhouse during a sort of weekend-long celebration of Frank's 70th birthday, or what would have been his 70th birthday. And something happened there which I will never forget as long as I live.
My God.
Well, one of the things I had to do was I had to act in a kind of any questions capacity, like David Dimbleby or Fiona Bruce.
Yes.
With these former mothers of invention. And that sort of passed without incident. But afterwards, and I'm not making this up, David, I'm not making this up, but afterwards, a youth aged about 20 sat down and removed both his artificial legs to be autographed. And I couldn't believe it was happening. And they, and his legs were covered in autographs. Paul McCartney was there, Ozzy Osbourne. His legs must be worth a fortune. And it was one of these situations where you sort of try not to register shock.
Yes.
Have you ever been in that sort of...
Absolutely. You're trying to think, you're having an internal conversation saying, let's just get through this and pretend that, just assume someone's watching and don't move your lips. Don't move the lips.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I suppose that's the only...
Or roll the eyes. I think that's the other one, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Poker face. That's the kind of...
But anyway, as I say, that was one of the jobs that Gail gave me while we were waiting to secure a publishing deal.
Yes. So you were kind of busily writing away here, but then working with Dave Berry as well as his backing... played keyboards in the mid. And then you went on to work with Reckless Eric, Jim McCarthy.
Jim McCarthy. Yeah. Jim McCarthy, who was a Yardbird, he actually wrote a lot of their stuff. He wrote Shapes of Things, or co-wrote it, and Still I'm Sad, Over, Under, Sideways, Down. And we actually wrote a song together called The Moonlight Skater.
Right.
Even to this day, I maintain satisfies every qualification of nothing less than a Christmas #1. But to paraphrase Mandy Rice Davis, I would say that, wouldn't I? But yeah, we wrote a song together, and it actually was covered by quite a few people. I mean, it was covered by a group called Stairway, who are one of the foremost new age groups on the...
What's the song called again?
The Moonlight Skater. And you can find it on YouTube. You can find my version on YouTube, and I think possibly Stairways as well. But Dave Berry did a version too.
I mean, did it? There's no pension pot there, was there?
No, there wasn't.
So shame. So you just need sort of Taylor Swift to cover it, and then you'll be happy. But
well, yeah, right. I mean, he even sent it to Cliff Richard because he sort of does Christmas material, doesn't he?
Well, absolutely. They love all that stuff. But
I mean, I did. I worked with him, and I also worked with Twinkle, whose big hit was Terry, which was a death disc in the same vein as Leader of the Pack.
Yes. So did you say you worked with Cliff Richard as well?
No. We sent Cliff. I mentioned him because a former Argonaut was in Cliff Richard's backing group.
Right.
Yeah. No, I didn't work with Cliff Richards. But I mean, like, all we did, we sent him the Moonlight Skater, and his manager got back to us and politely declined.
That's so mean, isn't it? That is so mean. Never mind. I mean, he could still have it there. So basically, you've written like hell throughout your life while playing music, I guess, as your more of a hobby than a.
Well, no, it's never been a hobby, but I mean, being an author has been my chief source of income.
Yes.
And as is often the case, you end up doing what you want to do second best, if you see what I mean.
Yes, this is always this is always the case, isn't it? But then you've been releasing new material, new books. I mean, you've been very prolific. You got this new one, Get Your Haircut,
yeah,
which came out on Old Castle Publishing.
That's what's right, in September.
And then you had a new album that came out in September as well.
Yeah, that's Clayson Singer-songwriter.
Beautiful. I know. I was listening to it today. It was amazing.
Oh, thanks.
And have you been doing much other solo stuff before then?
Oh yeah. I mean, I've been doing my sort of solo act, but I mean, Clayson Sings Chanson is a presentation by me and the Argonauts keyboard player, Andy Lavery, and that's been active since 2011 to coincide with a new edition of my biography of Jacques Brel, the famous Belgian chansonnier.
Yes, absolutely.
Familiar with him?
Well, absolutely. We went through that period. Did he do? I might have got this one because when you're in the 70s, when you're younger and you sort of want to going through a bit of I must discover more interesting things, because one has this idea, I think, and I might be rewriting this narrative, but trying to feel like I must be more interesting, so that, like you said at the beginning, you might attract, lovely relationships and women, and and people go, oh, there's David, he knows French films and Belgian singer-songwriters, and there is that kind of, I'm sure not everyone does, but there is a sense of, I remember the 80s being very much into sort of going to see foreign films and trying to get into the works of William Burroughs and Jack Kerouac and Hunter S. Thompson, and anything that might have given you that little edge that
what made you more interested.
One was so self-consciously sort of pretentious at times, and then you give up. But was he the one who wrote Seasons in the Sun?
Yes, he did. And Seasons in the Sun is a very sanitized version of the original song.
But it's still tragic, though.
Well, in a way, yes. But I mean, its origin was even more tragic, because Seasons in the Sun began as Le Moribund, which is about a man on his deathbed forgiving his wife all her routine adulteries with the other men of the village. And it, as I say, it got sanitized by somebody called Rod McEwen.
Oh, well, that was Terry Jacks.
No. Rod McEwen rewrote the lyrics, and Terry Jacks actually had the hit version of it.
Right.
1974, probably. Although, incidentally, Seasons in the Sun was the last, was recorded by Westlife, and it was the final British number one of the last century. But I mean, that's to the sort of average Joe, I suppose that's the most famous Jacques Brel song. I mean, there are others as well. I mean, we mentioned Amsterdam.
Yes.
And there's also If You Go Away, Namakita Pa.
Oh, my God.
Which is a sort of cabaret standard. All sorts of stuff. Next, which the Au Suivant, which...
Oh, Alex Harvey.
Yeah, that was by him as well. And I mean, I kind of discovered Jacques Brel through Scott Walker.
Of course.
Because he was the foremost mouthpiece of Brel in English-speaking territories. But I mean, that was a very interesting project. And after that, I was approached to do a book about Serge Gainsbourg. And he was one of the people whose book I did, where I began without knowing very much about him. I mean, all I knew about two things I knew about Serge Gainsbourg, which was his record, what is it, Je t'aime moi non plus,
Yes.
with Jane Birkin, which got to number one despite being banned by
And did he do a number with Brigitte Bardot as well?
Yes, he did that. That was the original version of Je t'aime moi non plus. But Brigitte Bardot's husband at the time sort of made such a fuss that it was withdrawn.
Right.
And Gainsbourg did it again with Jane Birkin. But like I say,
Bonnie and Clyde. He did a great version.
That was with Brigitte Bardot. Yeah, and that actually came out.
And when you put, I mean, you make out you've written about 30 plus books. I mean, this is quite a project, isn't it? I mean, how many years does it take to research and write and bring it out and feel?
Well, it's a bit sort of how long is a piece of string, really?
Yes.
It depends really on what sort of sources are available for research and whether you get the cooperation of the sort of dramatis personae involved. I mean, for example, I had, when I was doing the Trogs, I used to interview Reg Presley hour after hour after hour in his home in Andover. But there were often things that happened, when I was interviewing him that had nothing really much to do with the book. I remember one day when I'd been talking to him from about 10 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock in the evening. And when we decided we finished, do you know he was an expert on crop circles?
Oh, God, the 80s. I remember that period, yes, and the 90s.
Well, when we finished that particular day, he took me out to show me where a crop circle had been. It was still discernible. And I was very sceptical about it, about whether, I think most crop circles are manufactured by people with planks.
That's right.
And things like that. But he took me to this one, and I saw this for myself. While we were looking at it, this was early evening, and a flock of birds flew over in their characteristic V formation.
Yes.
And they scattered at random where the crop circle was and then regrouped. And Reg said that it was because there was an energy coming up from the crop circle through the Earth's inner space to something beyond.
Yes.
And I went away with the impression that Reg was either in possession of dangerous knowledge or else he was barking mad.
Well,
like I say, I saw this for myself,
I know, but it's interesting is that we like to I don't know, we like to sort of find meaning in random things and then put it together and say, look, that really did happen. And yeah, obviously that really did happen, but whether one can read the Earth's energy and ley lines as being something that was tangible is interesting, isn't it? Yeah. I think we want to believe it because it helps our day-to-day lives to think there's something magical and bigger out there, and life can feel a bit mundane and we can just look at the news getting more depressed. So it is quite nice to have a cosmic viewpoint at times.
Yeah.
But there you go. So look, lots of books. So you're writing. So, and then solo work as well. So have you got all this, your discography here, which is quite prolific. So there's been a lot of albums and then quite a few gaps. You had the ancient and modern highlights of half a century record that came out, and then various other little bits and pieces that have sort of come out. So is it the case that, again, this is your passion, but you have to sort of do the books to keep everything flowing?
That's more or less it, yeah. But there's always, as you suggested, somebody like Taylor Swift or Lady Gaga or somebody sort of latched onto the Moonlight Skater, then it would be all sort of.
Well, we're all going to go and sort of check that out. So for this year, though, which has been very prolific, you've done two bits and pieces here. What have you got sort of burning away for the sort of winter into next year?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, the Frank Zappa book's coming out at last, and I mean there are also Clayson sings chanson gigs coming up.
With the Frank Zappa, did you read the book that his daughter did?
Yeah.
And how did you find that?
I think it was very much from her perspective, obviously, and I think that she wasn't very happy with her upbringing, mainly because of her mother, and also because of the fact that he was a sort of absent father a lot of the time because he was always away on tour.
Yes.
But it certainly, I suspect that her viewpoint is different from those of her two brothers and sister. But yes, I did read that. And it was sort of faintly depressing, I think. But, it's a completely, you're actually sort of talking about an upbringing that was like no other, really. Certainly very different from mine, and I suspect yours.
Yes.
Well,
very different indeed. Yeah, I guess.
I mean, the only other things that are coming up is that, and I'm not making this up either, is on Bastille Day, in July, I was scheduled to do a gig with my friend Dick Taylor, who is he was a former Rolling Stone. That's Dick Taylor, not Mick Taylor.
Yes.
And he left the Stones shortly before their first single came out. And then he formed the Pretty Things. And I was scheduled to do a gig with him in Leytonstone in East London. And it was a festival. And it turned out there was another act on the bill called Resurrection, which contained sort of three latter-day Pretty Things. So it made sense for us to sort of amalgamate. And I couldn't believe that I was actually fronting I was the lead singer of the Pretty Things for that night. And I was doing Rosalind, Don't Bring Me Down, Honey, I Need, Midnight to Six, all their hits, in the same position as their late lead singer, Phil May.
Yes.
Afterwards, somebody actually thought I was Phil May and asked for my autograph. And I actually signed it Phil May because I didn't want to disillusion him.
No, absolutely. That would be.
Yeah,
it's
but
nice
the point is, I think there's another gig with this. Well, it's not so much the Pretty Things as a Pretty Things coming up as well. But I mean, there's also various other ideas. I mean, I've done a novel which I'm pitching, and there's also an autobiography called Nut Rocker, which might be coming out soon as well. But, we'll have to wait and see.
Yes. And did you also work with this other singer called Jane, is it Ralph?
Yeah, Jane Ralph. Well, I didn't really work with her. I mean, I met her a couple of times. I mean, she was one of the people that did a cover version of the Moonlight Skater, which came out on her album called Jane's Renaissance.
Right.
Because she used to be in Renaissance, which was one of the groups that the Yardbirds spawned, as well as Led Zeppelin. There was another group called Renaissance, which actually became a hit-making.
Yeah, well, I did an interview with Annie
Haslam.
Yeah, last year. I think she's in America because there was some box set had come out.
Yeah.
Not about her, but the guy, John Wheaton, who was in one of those proggy bands, and I think she'd sung vocals. He died a few years ago, and they had a 8 CD box set. And so they did Northern Lights, didn't they, Renaissance?
Yes, that's right. That was their big hit.
So basically, was Jane in the band to begin with and then left?
She was, as was Jim McCarty and Keith Relf, who was the Yardbirds lead singer, Jane's brother. but they only lasted for one album, and then they surrendered the entire group to the sort of Annie Haslam lineup.
Yes, blimey. And I think now, yes, I expect they're all just in retirement, actually, aren't they, at the moment? Yes, as age has crept up on everybody. So, yes, there's quite a lot of bits and pieces that are all coming out. So with this book, and then you've got the Zappa book, is there any other publications that you're working on?
Well, not really. I mean, I'm sort of doing little bits and pieces. To be honest, I'm most of the time now I'm doing composition. Although I have to admit that sort of stuff that I'm writing nowadays tends to get more and more obscure, I suppose.
Yes.
But I mean, there's certainly going to be another album coming out, hopefully by the end of next year.
Amazing. And what's the theme of this one going to be?
Well, at the moment, I'm not sure. I mean, I could overfulfill about 3 albums, because I've built up such a lot of material. It's a case of going through it and deciding what to include.
Yes, the track listing.
Well, going through all my sort of dodgy demos and deciding what's worth working on.
Yes.
Well, sometimes the demos turn out to be as good as a master recording, But yeah, that's what I'm doing mostly these days. I'm sort of doing composition. Although, I mean, I've got ideas for another novel. But it depends whether I, can fit that in somewhere.
Well, quite. I mean, you have been so prolific. It's amazing. But obviously, you can keep it rolling.
Yeah, hopefully.
And lastly, if you were able to whisper something to your 16-year-old self starting out, is there anything in particular that you would have gone, oh, that would have been a good thing to have done? Or
would I advise my 16-year-old self?
Yes.
No, I would probably try and steal his ideas. But I mean, I don't know. I don't know what I'd advise.
Were there any things that you thought, oh, that was a good idea, I'm glad I did that, or anything that you thought, yeah, that was a bit of a, not a trap?
Well, yeah, obviously the single we did for Virgin, I wish that, I mean, the amount of money they spent on doing that, I could have probably recorded about 3 albums on that amount of money. It just, all that money was spent on 2.5 minutes of absolute crap, But there you go. That's the sort of music business for you.
Yes, it's tricky, isn't it? It's tricky. But look, Alan, thank you ever so much for this. This has been amazing. Your life story is brilliant.
David.
And yes, if you want, I can always send you the link, and then you could use it on your website anyway.
Very much like. When's this likely to come out?
Well, I think I'll get it going for next week, because it's always good to keep these things rolling.
You're going to have to edit it down pretty succinctly, aren't you?
Yeah, but it can be quite nice to put most of it up just so that people quite like hearing the whole bits and the story. Because what I found doing this show, which I've done quite a lot recently, well, for the last 7 years, is that people learn a lot about a person that they had no idea about, and they think, or they had an idea and they thought, bloody hell, that was amazing. So they enjoy those moments that they get to hear.
Yeah, I mean, what's your listenership? I mean, how wide is it?
Oh, it's because it's kind of anybody in the world can sort of tune into, because it's on Spotify and iTunes and anything else. So, it's interesting how certain countries, it's mostly the UK, then it's America, then it's Australia and Europe.
Right. Yeah.
So it gets, people do love it, and I
don't even know where you're based.
Well, I'm in Norwich.
Oh, right, yeah.
And where are you based?
Well, I'm in between Reading and Henley-on-Thames at the moment.
Right.
There's been talk of moving to the Isle of Wight for quite a while now.
Yes.
I used to record up in Newcastle. Is that I said that right? Near Norwich.
Yeah.
Cottesey.
Oh, Cossey.
Was that how you say it?
Yeah, so Costasy or Cossey.
Yeah, well, I used to record there with Reckless Eric.
Oh,
quite a
yes, because
lot.
Reckless lives in Cromer, doesn't he?
No, that's somebody called the Curator. Wait a minute. Yes, I think Eric has moved back to England.
Yeah,
He
because
was
I
a lot-
interviewed him last year when he had that album out, and he was based on the Norfolk coast, I think. And
Yeah, well,
there was
we did most of the album that I did with him was done in France when he was over there in Aquitaine.
yes,
Then after that, he moved to New York State,
that's right.
and as you've discovered, he's moved back to
Yes,
England.
doing little dates around the place,
Yeah.
and Eddie had a new album come out as well.
Yeah.
So he's done. Are there any? Oh yeah, because you've obviously read every rock book. Is there any books in particular that you would recommend? By the way, music books. Anything that you thought, God, I love that book.
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, there are authors that I quite admire, like the late Johnny Rogan, for example, Philip Norman, Nick Cohen. I mean,
Oh yes,
I could tell you loads of people like that, but I think we're going off on another tangent here.
we are. But Johnny
I mean,
Logan.
the thing is, I could talk to you for another hour about my relationship with Reckless Eric, but I don't think, I think really we talked a lot, but I mean, we really just scratched the surface of a very large iceberg.
Of an iceberg that was there, wasn't it? Dear old Reckless. Anyway, did you listen to his last album?
What's it called?
I can't remember, but I think it was all well received. He suddenly got very good press for it.
I don't think I have. I've heard the one before that. In fact, I had a song called California, which I remember. But yeah, I mean, I've also I did a feature recently for Rock and Reel about Amy Rigby, who is Eric's wife.
Oh yes,
She's quite a well-known singer-songwriter. So I'm still sort of in touch with him, and we kind of, ring each other every now and then. I haven't done so for quite a while. But anyway.
yes. Well, anyway, did you go back a long way with Eric?
Yes, I have. I mean, we led parallel careers in the sense that everywhere Clayson and the Argonauts played, Eric had been either there the week before or the week after.
Right.
But I didn't actually meet him until just after the group broke up in 1985, when we did some recording at his place in Chatham, when he was with the Len Bright Combo.
Oh God, I remember that. Somebody must have nailed us together.
Yeah, that was it. Great single, that one. And then after that, he vanished to France, and we didn't speak again for another 7 years. And then when we did, we started talking about doing some recording together, and it eventually led to an album called One Dover Soul, which came out in 2012, and that was done partly in New Cossey. Can you tell me how you say that?
New Cossey.
Well, we did it partly in New Cossey, but mostly we did it in Cusack, which was a village where he and Amy lived in France.
Oh, yeah. Oh well, I guess that was probably an up and down relationship at times.
Yeah, it was a bit. Yeah. Well, you know what I mean? It's sort of two very creative people throwing in different ideas all the time. But
yes.
Yeah.
And on that bombshell, we'll leave it there, but a massive thank you to Alan Clayson for giving me the time for that interview. As I said, I will put a link to his website in the notes below, but worth checking out. This has been the C86 show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, just do C86 show. All these shows have been archived, so you can find those on Spotify, iTunes, Podbeam, and probably various other sites. But anyway, fill your boots. Have a great week. Stay safe.